I'm going to read one more scripture for us, and then Joe will come up and teach us from the word. This is Exodus 32, 7-14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth?' Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, 'I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever.' Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened."
It's great to be here again sharing with you on this fourth Sunday of Lent. My name is Joe Krafchick, as Zach said. For those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet yet, I am happy to be here. Occasionally, I get invited to share on a Sunday morning, so here I am, not long after the last time I was up here. But it's great to be here this morning. Today's Old Testament text has a little bit of a story behind it. Joanne sent out the Friday updates email yesterday, which you all received, talking that I would be preaching from Exodus 32, 9-14, or 7-14, which was quite a surprise as I've been preparing my sermon on Joshua chapter 5, verses 9-12. So there was a slight heart palpitation and moment of reckoning as I emailed Joanne and said, "I'm actually not planning on preaching from Exodus tomorrow." And so I kind of did some digging, went back through my emails, and at some point we had one copy of the lectionary with the verses that were written out that included Exodus, but the version that I'd been looking at has Joshua chapter 5, 9-12. So I'm not sure where the wires got crossed, but if you are here anticipating a sermon on Exodus 32, you're going to be slightly disappointed, because we're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 5, verses 9-12. So the book of Joshua, if we're placing it in the story of the Old Testament, the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness for a generation. Their time of wandering has concluded, and they are now preparing to enter the Promised Land. Moses has passed away at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and the Israelites are now being led by Joshua. The spies have been sent ahead to Jericho, and they've returned. The Israelites have crossed the Jordan River, and they have entered into the Promised Land. They have not yet engaged with any of the cities of the Canaan, outside of the spies visiting Rahab in Jericho. Chapter 5, where we'll be looking today, outlines two different ceremonies that happen upon the Israelites entering the Promised Land, but before the campaign of settling in the country begins. Our text today is focused on the second of those ceremonies, which is celebrating the Passover. Our Old Testament text from the lectionary, depending on which version you read, is only 4 verses long today. It gives us an opportunity to closely focus on what's going on. I believe that this is a really important story, and hopefully it has lots to say to us today as well, not just in the context of the ancient world. When I'm up here on Sunday mornings, I probably spend quite a bit of my time talking about things like history, culture, interpretation. And that comes from when I first started at Columbia Bible College and I was taking classes in biblical studies. These are the topics and the sorts of things that I found so interesting. Growing up, I always liked history, but to look at the Bible now and these stories that I grew up with and be able to place them in a historical context, consider them within their culture, and think about how that might affect our understanding and interpretation. These are the sorts of things that brought the biblical stories to new life for me. They form them in a new way, and they get me really excited. There's a quote from Pope Gregory I in his commentary on Job. He writes that Scripture is like a river again, broad and deep, shallow enough here for the lamb to go wading, but deep enough there for the elephant to swim. One of the beauties of Scripture is that it is simple enough for everyone to understand and engage with its central truths, while also being profoundly deep and worthy of extra time and effort to understand more fully. And we can see that in today's text. A seemingly minor 4 verses about the Israelites celebrating Passover that would be very easy to skip over on the way to getting to the story of the battle for Jericho. However, when we pause here and we stop to dig in deeper, we can maybe draw out some bigger ideas and thoughts about what is going on and what this text has to say to us. So let's read that text here now, since it's only 4 verses. So Joshua chapter 5, verses 9 to 12. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." And so that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the Israelites were camped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. Our passage begins by talking about the disgrace of Egypt being rolled away. The Lord is telling the people that the Egypt chapter of their story is now finished. Even though they had been out of Egypt for a generation, wandering in the wilderness, their lack of faith caused them to have to wait to get to this point. The Lord is now rolling that whole episode away. One thing to note here is that the Bible as a whole really likes wordplay. And sadly, because we are not Old Testament Hebrew or New Testament Greek speakers, we often miss this wordplay when it happens. When a location or a place is given a name in the Old Testament, it usually has to do with what's going on in that story. So here, the disgrace of Egypt has been rolled away, and the place is called Gilgal. The Hebrew word for rolled away or rolling is galal. So there's something going on here with this rolling away or this galal taking place at Gilgal, kind of like a Hebrew rhyming or wordplay. The naming of things is often done as part of Israel's story to help the people remember. They weren't writing this down as they went. They were telling these stories to their children and their grandchildren and throughout the generations. So naming this place Gilgal, when you would come to this place and remember its name, it would bring to mind that Hebrew word galal, which is a reminder that this is where the Lord said, "I have rolled away the disgrace from Egypt." This is where everything that happened in Egypt is finally set aside by the Lord. The place name is maybe a bit confusing because this place apparently already had a name, which if you read earlier in chapter 5 in verse 3. The biblical writers don't shy away from multiple names for places or even changing the names of places either, because things aren't already confusing enough for us as modern readers. We have to keep track of these things as well. Anyway, continuing on, the Israelites are camped at Gilgal, and they kept the Passover, which is telling us that they celebrated or remembered or observed the Passover. We're now 2 verses into our 4-verse passage, and we have a pretty big clue that this is really a text about looking back at what has already happened and looking forward at the same time. The Passover is to be kept or observed by the Israelites to commemorate their exodus out of Egypt. They were finally allowed by Pharaoh to leave Egypt after God sends a plague killing the firstborn of all the families in Egypt, passing over only the homes which had lamb's blood on the doors, literally passing over. And only after this plague happens does Pharaoh allow the Israelites to leave Egypt before he, of course, changes his mind again. Sometimes as modern Christian readers, we lose some of the significance or the importance to all this remembering and commemorating and looking back in the Old Testament. The Exodus and being delivered out of slavery is a monumental event in the history of God's people. This is their salvation event, where God literally came down, saved them, and led them out of slavery. It's part of their covenant with God. It's woven into their identity as his people. The Passover is kept to remind the people of their salvation from Egypt. The Passover commemorates the event which led to Israel leaving Egypt, and now, here at Gilgal, the Passover is being kept as they prepare for another major event, settling the Promised Land. It's a good sign that the people are keeping Passover. Things are going well. People are being faithful and preparing for what's next. The Passover was something that was meant to be kept and celebrated moving forward. God gave instruction for this to the people in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 5 to 8. In that passage it says, "In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the Lord. And on the 15th day of the same month is the festival of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not work at your occupations. For 7 days you shall present the Lord's offerings by fire. On the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall not work at your occupations." So it's clear they're supposed to celebrate the Passover at the same time every year on the 14th and the 15th of the month, and they're not supposed to work. In Joshua, we read that the Israelites have the dates right for the Passover. It lines up. And at dusk on the 14th, they're observing Passover, and on the next day, the 15th, there's a feast with unleavened bread. Eventually, Passover would become a pilgrimage festival. When Israel is established in the country, you would go to Jerusalem for the festival and offer a burnt offering that was to be made at the temple in Jerusalem. The idea of a burnt offering is that by burning it, the smoke that comes up from the offering goes up to God. And so it makes sense that this would be done at the temple in Jerusalem, as the temple was constructed by the people as a place for God to live among them. What's brought to mind here with the Passover at Gilgal is that it's another milestone marker in the story of God's people. Just as the Passover led them out of one land, they celebrate Passover and prepare to go into a new land. It's also worth noting that this tracks along with our journey through the season of Lent. We're maybe getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but the reason Jesus enters Jerusalem on Holy Week on Palm Sunday is that he's going there with all the Jewish people in the New Testament world for Passover. That's why he's going there, because that's what you're supposed to do. The day after the Passover, the people eat the produce of the land. This is significant, and I want to back out a bit from our text now. Those of you that were here a few weeks ago for my last message got to hear me talk about first fruits and offerings and giving from the harvest. We spent some time looking at the covenants between Abram and God, and I want to revisit that again this morning. I probably should have started with this question in my last sermon talking about covenants. What is a covenant? Essentially, it's an agreement between two parties. There's conditions, stipulations, things that need to be met by both sides. And what is interesting about the covenants between God and Abram is that there's a power imbalance there. We would then expect that this power imbalance would be reflected in the covenant that's made between God and Abram, where the party with the greater power, God, can then exert that power that he has and enter into a covenant that meets his own advantage. In the ancient world mythologies outside of Israel, any covenant between a divine being and a person would reflect that power imbalance, because the people in these other cultures and these other mythologies are there simply to serve their gods. But that's not what the God of Israel does when he makes a covenant with his people, because he loves his people. He created them in his image. He instead willingly enters into covenant with Abram and promises him all sorts of things: descendants, land, to be a great nation, to be a blessing to the whole world. This is not the sort of agreement you would expect an all-powerful God to make with a mere mortal person. But this God is different. What I didn't talk about in my previous covenant discussion is that there are also expectations of Abram and his descendants to fulfill their end of the covenant. Covenants, to a certain extent, are about having faith. When you enter into a covenant with someone, you are putting faith that that other party is going to maintain their end of the covenant as you maintain your end. One of the covenants we make all the time today is when we get married. We make a covenant to our spouse, and we even say vows that we repeat back and forth to each other, that we are pledging to do something just as we have faith that our spouse will also do the same thing. In the context of Abraham, one of the requirements that God gives is circumcision, which is everyone's favorite Sunday morning topic. And we can probably boil down the purpose of circumcision as being the physical sign or the physical symbol of a spiritual identity. It's a physical mark that identifies you as one of God's people in the Old Testament. Earlier, I said that Joshua chapter 5 was about two ceremonies, and we were talking about the second one in Passover. The first ceremony in the chapter is circumcision. Throughout the wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites have not been keeping up with this end of their covenant. So after crossing the Jordan River, they now stop in the new land to circumcise all the males in the country. These two ceremonies undertaken by the Israelites, circumcision and Passover, are exercises in faith and covenant loyalty. The entire nation of people, descendants promised to Abram, are about to embark on a campaign that's going to involve fighting, conquering, conflict, and settling a new land among people that aren't always receptive to this idea. The first thing this group of people, the Israelites, do upon entering this new land is mass circumcision and Passover. As a strategy for entering and settling a new country, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They've crossed the Jordan River. They're in Canaan with an entire nation of people. They've already sent spies to Jericho in advance of this battle that's coming, and now they stop to temporarily incapacitate their entire army. After doing that, they then celebrate the Passover, which is very clear. They're not supposed to do any work. They're supposed to stop and pause and remember where they have come from. What these two ceremonies are about is faith. Because in doing these things and choosing to be faithful, the Israelites have left themselves very, very vulnerable. They are placing all of their hopes for physical protection in the covenant that they have made with the Lord. It's ridiculous. It defies any sort of common sense or logic that this is what you would do when you start on what is essentially a military campaign. Throughout the Old Testament, Israel's story of faithfulness and covenantal obedience is a bit up and down, to say the least. Probably much like our own stories as well. We have periods of great faithfulness, periods of maybe not so great faithfulness. This is a high point, though, for Israel in Joshua 5. They're following through on their covenantal obligations. They're circumcising the people, the men, they're observing Passover, and they're doing these things at a very precarious time and place. This is kind of an Old Testament Jesus take the wheel moment for Israel. So after all that, let's come back to our text where the people eat the produce of the land. This is important, and the text is actually telling us that it's very important that they're eating the produce of the land. It tells us this by repeating it 3 times. In Hebrew, you emphasize things by repeating it over and over again. There are no exclamation marks to be used. There's no bold fonts or underlining in the Hebrew manuscripts. Emphasis is made through repetition. That's why often when we read the Psalms or the prophetic language, it will talk about the Lord and it'll say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord." The point is emphasizing that the Lord is really, really holy. That's why we're repeating it 3 times. So when something is repeated over and over again in the span of a couple verses, it's the author's way of telling us, pay attention, like read closely, something is going on here. So let's reread verses 11 and 12, where it tells us 3 times that the people eat the crops or produce from the land. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. 3 times it talks about eating the crops or the produce of the land. Why is there this emphasis? In verse 12, it tells us that the people no longer had manna. The manna was the magical bread given by God to the people that would appear daily for them to harvest and would sustain them through their wandering time in the wilderness. The manna was a symbol, a very real symbol of God's provision for his people, that he didn't bring them out of Egypt just to starve them in the wilderness. Even in the middle of their disobedience that led to wandering for an entire generation, God provided sustenance for them to keep them going. But now, in Joshua, it's gone. They ate the produce of the land, the crops of the land. The time of manna is finished. They are moving towards something different. I think that all of these things we covered in this text help to distill some ideas for us today. Ideas about provision and blessing from God, ideas about faithfulness and covenants, ideas about looking forward while also looking back, and they probably all relate to each other as well. For provision and blessing, look at the way in which the Israelites are provided for throughout their history. God cares for his people and provides for them in practical ways. It is worth noting that this provision and care does change over time. The Israelites arrive in the promised land, and they are no longer given manna to eat. This doesn't mean that God has stopped providing for them or abandoned them or turned his back on them. Now, instead of manna, they have the land which can yield produce and yield crops for them. There's something to be said for the idea of God providing and also providing in a number of different ways. When a provision or a blessing changes or even stops, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned his people. It doesn't mean that God has abandoned us, whether this be in the Old Testament or us today. Change shouldn't automatically be correlated with loss and thought of as abandonment. This can be really hard. People, as a general rule, don't like change. We especially are resistant to change that is imposed on us by others. It's understandable that there is a correlation or a feeling that change is bad, and therefore this change that is happening is not a blessing. We might get the feeling that change happens to us is a removal of provision or a removal of blessing. We should strive to be open to and look for positives in the midst of change. We can't continue to eat manna forever. Eventually, the land has to yield crops and produce. Through all of these changes and seasons, God is there alongside us. God doesn't change, and his love for his people, his provision for us, doesn't change either. I'll invite the band to come up as I wrap up here. This brings us to the idea of faithfulness and covenants. Even as we experience change and the ups and downs of life, we need to cling tight to the idea that God is still there with us. Living life that way is what it means to live in faith. The Israelites put all their faith in God's protection, that right after entering a foreign land that they're going to settle, after scouting the city of Jericho, they undertook 2 ceremonies that made them physically defenseless. They're placing the hope for their protection in God. Hopefully, we work to embrace this similar life of faithfulness, that we can also step out in the knowledge that we're not doing this life alone. The Israelites were moving forward into the promised land and working toward establishing themselves as a country and a nation in the land that God had given them. As they prepare to take this next step, it is always in light of where they have come from. For us, as we continue today and we navigate new challenges, we should also be doing it with an eye to our past. What is probably important is that it is with an eye to the past while recognizing that the past is the past. It's important to remember where we have come from, but also important that we don't just stay in the past or attempt to recreate the past in the future. Nostalgia is a part of human nature, and there's always a sense of yearning for the good old days and a mistrust of our current reality and future. The reality is that the world is ever-changing, and with the changing times, we will face all sorts of new challenges that require us to be able to change and grow. The key, I think, is doing this in faithfulness. Instead of yearning for or idolizing the past, we can learn from it, treasure it, and use it to help guide our future and our present. We can take solace in knowing that even as the world around us changes, God is still with us, unchanging, providing for us, watching over us, his people. As our situations change, it does not mean God has abandoned us or forgotten us. As things change, he has not shied away from us. We can be confident in moving forward with God and finding our own way to be a blessing to the world around us.